12 doctors couldn't save the millionaire's daughter, until the new black cleaning lady saw what no one else could see. The scream echoed through the marble hallways of the Beverly Hills mansion at 3:47 a.m. Victoria Whitmore, just 6 years old, was having her fourth seizure of the week, and this time the blood coming from her mouth was more than the private doctors could explain. "Call Dr. Richardson again," shouted Catherine Whitmore, heiress to a pharmaceutical empire, holding her violently convulsing daughter in her arms. Her husband James ran around the room in a panic, frantically dialing numbers of specialists who cost thousands of dollars per consultation. Keisha Washington watched everything from the bedroom door, her cleaning bag still in her hand. It was her third day working in that house, hired only to clean the bathrooms and vacuum the Persian rugs. But at 34, after working 5 years as an emergency technician before losing her license for reporting medical malpractice at a public hospital, she recognized those symptoms. "Mrs. Whitmore," Keisha said calmly, stepping forward. "Excuse me, but may I suggest something?" James Whitmore turned around angrily. "You shouldn't even be up here. Go back downstairs right now." Catherine barely glanced at Keisha, focused entirely on her daughter. "James, please, not now. Victoria is dying, and no doctor can figure out what." "External substance poisoning," Keisha interrupted, her firm voice cutting through the chaos. "Someone is poisoning your daughter." The silence that followed was broken only by Victoria's gasping breaths as she finally stopped convulsing. Catherine looked at Keisha for the first time, her blue eyes wide with shock and despair. "What the hell are you talking about?" James growled. "You're a maid. How dare you?" "Because I've seen this before," Keisha replied, approaching the bed. "In the 3 days I've been here, your daughter has had seizures at the same time every day, always after drinking the calming tea that someone prepares especially for her." Catherine felt her heart race. Mrs. Hartford's tea. But she's been taking care of Victoria for 4 years, since she was born. She would never. "Ma'am, may I examine the girl's mouth?" Keisha asked, ignoring James completely. "If I'm right about what I suspect, we'll find physical evidence." James lunged toward Keisha. "Get out of my house right now. Some maid isn't going to touch my daughter." But Catherine held her husband's arm. Something in Keisha's determined gaze, in the way she spoke with real medical knowledge, made a desperate mother make a decision that would change everything. "Let her examine her," Catherine whispered, her hands trembling as she held Victoria. "James, 12 doctors have seen our daughter. 12. And none of them could explain why she's dying. If there's a chance, a single chance to save our girl." Keisha approached the bed, took the flashlight from her cell phone, and gently opened Victoria's mouth. What she saw made her blood run cold. At the back of the child's throat were small fragments of something that glowed under the artificial light. "Ground glass," she said, her voice low but firm. "Someone has been putting finely ground glass in your daughter's tea for at least 3 weeks. Enough to cause internal bleeding and seizures, but not enough to kill her immediately." Catherine felt her legs buckle. "No. It can't be. Does Mrs. Hartford always insist that Victoria drink the tea before bed?" Keisha asked, already knowing the answer from the look of growing horror in Catherine's eyes. "Always," Catherine whispered. "She says it's to help Victoria sleep better, that it's a special recipe from her family." James was still trying to process this. "Are you accusing our housekeeper of 4 years of trying to murder our daughter?" Keisha looked him straight in the eye. "I'm saying that someone in this house is systematically poisoning a child, and if you want to save your daughter, you need to stop questioning me and start acting like a father." Catherine's phone rang. Dr. Richardson was calling back. But for the first time in 3 weeks of agony, she didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Keisha with a mixture of hope and terror. "What do we do now?" If you're enjoying this story of justice and discovery, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what Keisha would do in the next few minutes would not only save Victoria's life, but expose a truth so disturbing that it would completely destroy the trust that family had placed in those close to them for years. Mrs. Dorothy Hartford appeared at the bedroom door like a silent ghost, her pale hands holding a tray with the usual steaming tea. At 58, with gray hair tied in a perfect bun, she had been the model housekeeper for 4 years, caring for Victoria since she was a baby with seemingly unwavering dedication. "Oh my goodness, Victoria!" she exclaimed in a melodious, concerned voice. "Another seizure? Poor thing." Her light blue eyes quickly scanned the room until they landed on Keisha, still standing by the bed with her cell phone flashlight in her hand. "Mrs. Hartford," Catherine said, her voice trembling, "this is Keisha, our new." "She thinks," Catherine hesitated, unable to utter the words. "That someone is poisoning Victoria with ground glass in her tea," Keisha finished bluntly, watching every micro-expression on the governess's face. Mrs. Hartford blinked slowly once. "Pardon? Ground glass?" Her voice carried the perfectly calibrated tone of someone genuinely shocked. "My God, what a terrible accusation. Who would do such a thing to our dear girl?" James crossed his arms, satisfied. "See? That's exactly what I said. Mrs. Hartford loves Victoria like family. This woman is clearly trying to cause trouble." "Who are you again?" Mrs. Hartford asked Keisha, her voice maintaining its polite tone but with an almost imperceptible chill around the edges. "I don't recall being introduced." "Keisha Washington. Housekeeper for 3 days," Keisha replied, maintaining eye contact. "Before that, emergency technician at General Hospital for 5 years. "Ah, technician," Mrs. Hartford repeated, as if the word had a bitter taste. "And now you work cleaning bathrooms. What an interesting career progression." The social venom of that sentence hit its intended target. James smiled cruelly. Catherine looked away, uncomfortable but not intervening. "I lost my license because I reported negligent doctors who were killing poor patients out of sheer laziness," Keisha replied with cutting calm. "I discovered they were funded by the same board that administers medical licenses. Whistleblower is not a popular profession in the American healthcare system." Something changed in the air. Catherine looked at Keisha with new attention. Even James was momentarily silent. Mrs. Hartford tilted her head, studying Keisha with renewed interest. "What a tragic story. And now you're trying to diagnose, based on what exactly?" 3 days of observing our family. "Based on 15 years of medical experience," Keisha replied. "And the fact that Victoria only has seizures after drinking your special tea." "My special tea?" Mrs. Hartford laughed, a crystal-clear and seemingly innocent sound. "It's chamomile with honey, Mrs. Whitmore can confirm. My own grandmother's recipe. I've been using it for years to help children with insomnia." Catherine nodded hesitantly. "That's true, she always made that tea for Victoria." "And Victoria has had these episodes ever since Mrs. Hartford started making it?" Keisha asked directly. The silence stretched out for a few long seconds. Catherine frowned, clearly trying to remember. "Well, no, the seizures started a few months ago." 3 months, Keisha specified. "When Victoria stopped drinking commercial tea and started drinking only Mrs. Hartford's special tea, correct?" Mrs. Hartford kept smiling, but Keisha noticed her hands imperceptibly tightening on the tray. "What a detailed analysis, for someone who's only been here 3 days." "It's just that I pay attention to children being systematically poisoned," Keisha replied with polar coldness. "It catches my attention." James exploded. "Enough. I will not tolerate some maid accusing our trusted housekeeper." Mrs. Hartford practically raised Victoria. "You're fired, get out of my house right now." "James, wait," Catherine interrupted him. For the first time in weeks, there was something like hope in her voice. What if she's right?" "Catherine." Mrs. Hartford exclaimed hurtfully. "Do you really believe I would harm Victoria? After everything we've been through together?" Keisha watched the psychological game unfold. Mrs. Hartford was good, excellent, in fact. Every word calculated to appeal to emotional history, every facial expression perfectly calibrated to convey pain and betrayal. "Mrs. Whitmore," Keisha said calmly, "may I do a simple test that will resolve this right now?" "What kind of test?" Catherine asked. "Let Mrs. Hartford drink the tea she made for Victoria." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Hartford blinked twice quickly, the first genuine reaction she had shown since entering the room. "Excuse me," she said, her voice slightly louder. "If it's chamomile with honey from your grandmother's recipe, there should be no problem with you drinking it," Keisha explained with relentless logic. "After all, you must have had it hundreds of times, right?" Well, of course I have, but," Mrs. Hartford stammered for the first time. James tried to intervene. "This is ridiculous. Mrs. Hartford doesn't have to prove anything to." "I'll drink it," Mrs. Hartford said abruptly, cutting James off. "Of course I will. It's just tea." She picked up the delicate cup from the tray, brought it to her lips, and stopped. Her eyes met Keisha's for a split second. At that moment, they both knew the game had completely changed. "Actually," Mrs. Hartford said, lowering the cup, "I just remembered I'm on antibiotics. I shouldn't mix them with herbal remedies." Keisha smiled for the first time since she had entered the house. It was not a kind smile. "Antibiotics for what, Mrs. Hartford?" "Urinary tract infection," she replied quickly. "Very common in women my age." "Which antibiotic specifically?" Keisha pressed. "Because chamomile doesn't interact negatively with penicillin, amoxicillin, cephalosporins, or quinolones. I learned that in nursing school." Mrs. Hartford turned pale. I don't remember the specific name." Catherine slowly got up from the bed where she was holding Victoria. "Mrs. Hartford, could you please drink the tea? To put my mind at ease." The housekeeper looked at Catherine with an expression of utter betrayal. "Mrs. Whitmore, how can you ask this after 4 years of dedication to your family?" "Please," Catherine whispered. "It's just 1 cup. If you love Victoria as you've always said." Mrs. Hartford looked at the cup in her hands. Then at Keisha. Then at James, seeking support. James was quiet now, finally processing what was happening. Mrs. Hartford began, and then did something no innocent person would do in that situation. She turned the tray over, throwing the cup and tea onto the marble floor, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Oh no! How clumsy of me!" she exclaimed, but her voice sounded too artificial. "Now I can't taste anything." Keisha calmly knelt on the floor and carefully picked up a fragment of the spilled liquid with her fingertip. She put it on her tongue and immediately spat it out. Metallic taste. Slightly gritty texture even after straining. "Mrs. Whitmore, I strongly recommend that you call the police right now." Mrs. Hartford backed toward the door. "This is ridiculous. It's persecution. James, you're not going to let this person humiliate me like this." But James was looking at the broken glass on the floor, finally connecting dots he should have connected months ago. "Mrs. Hartford," he said slowly, "where did you get this special tea recipe?" The housekeeper hesitated for just a second, but it was enough time. "My grandmother, as I said." "You told me your grandmother died when you were 3, Catherine said softly. "I remember because you cried when you told me during your first week on the job." What that wealthy and powerful family didn't know yet was that Mrs. Dorothy Hartford wasn't even her real name, and that the woman they had trusted to care for their daughter for 4 years had much darker reasons for being in that house than anyone could have imagined. Reasons that were about to be revealed in a way that would forever change the way they viewed trust, privilege, and the truth about who was really protecting their lives. Mrs. Hartford took another step back, but there was nowhere else to go. The marble wall blocked her escape, and 3 pairs of eyes watched her with growing suspicion. Her years of refined psychological manipulation were crumbling because of a cleaning lady she had completely underestimated. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. 4 years of dedication, of love for this family, and you're going to believe some random person who arrived here 3 days ago? Keisha didn't take the bait of veiled prejudice. Instead, she took out her cell phone and began taking pictures of the broken glass on the floor, the spilled liquid, the poorly disguised look of panic on Mrs. Hartford's face. "What are you doing?" James asked. "Documenting evidence," Keisha replied calmly, "because when the police arrive, they'll need more than just our words." Mrs. Hartford laughed, but the sound came out forced, artificial. "Police? Over spilled tea? What a drama queen." "Mrs. Hartford," Catherine said softly, her voice trembling, "if you have nothing to hide, why didn't you go to the hospital with us the last 6 times Victoria had seizures? You always found excuses to stay home." The housekeeper blinked rapidly. Hospitals make me nervous. I've always said that." Keisha looked up from her phone. "Nervous how? Like claustrophobic, or nervous like you're afraid of being recognized by a doctor or nurse?" The silence stretched on too long. Mrs. Hartford looked at Keisha with a hatred she could no longer mask. "Who do you think you are, interrogating me like this?" "Someone who recognizes patterns of systematic poisoning when she sees them," Keisha replied. "And someone who knows that people who commit this kind of crime have usually done it before." Catherine sat down heavily on the bed next to Victoria, who was still sleeping under the effects of sedation. My God, Mrs. Hartford, how many families? How many families what? Mrs. Hartford exploded. I've dedicated my life to caring for children. I've worked for respectable families for decades. Can you give me the names of those families? Keisha asked casually, but James noticed that she was recording the conversation on her cell phone. I don't have to prove anything to you. Actually, a male voice said from the doorway, you do. Everyone turned around. A tall, gray-haired man with an LAPD badge was standing in the doorway. Detective Marco Rodriguez, 45, had responded to the emergency call Catherine had finally made 5 minutes earlier. Detective Rodriguez, he introduced himself, showing his ID. I received a call about possible child poisoning. Mrs. Hartford paled visibly. Detective, there has been a misunderstanding. This woman, she pointed to Keisha, is making accusations based on social prejudice. Rodriguez looked at Keisha. And you are? Keisha Washington. Former emergency technician, current house employee. Identified signs of systematic poisoning in the child. The detective nodded and then looked at the broken glass on the floor. Can someone explain to me what happened here? Keisha took a deep breath. This was her chance to make a difference, to use all the knowledge that had cost her previous career to save a life. Detective, Mrs. Hartford had been preparing special teas for Victoria for months. The child only had seizures after drinking these teas. When we asked her to drink her own tea as a test, she refused and threw everything on the floor. I tripped. Mrs. Hartford protested. Detective, Catherine interrupted, may I show you Victoria's medical records? She has seen 12 different doctors in the last 3 months. None of them could diagnose what was causing the seizures and bleeding. Rodriguez took notes as he observed each person in the room. His 15 years of experience in domestic abuse cases had taught him to read body language, and Mrs. Hartford was exhibiting all the classic signs of guilt and desperation. Mrs. Hartford, I'm going to need you to come to the station to give a statement. I'm not going anywhere, she shouted, completely losing the elegant composure she had maintained for 4 years. You can't make me. I have rights. You do, Rodriguez agreed calmly, including the right to remain silent. But if you refuse to cooperate voluntarily, I can get a warrant based on the evidence we already have. Keisha approached the detective. Sir, may I suggest testing the ingredients in the kitchen? If she was grinding glass regularly, there must be residue somewhere. Mrs. Hartford took a sharp step toward the door. I will not tolerate this persecution any longer. But Rodriguez casually blocked her exit. Actually, ma'am, now that there's suspicion of a crime against a minor, I need you to stay here until forensics arrives. Forensics? James asked. We're going to test everything. Kitchen utensils, ingredients, residue on the floor. If ground glass is being used systematically, we'll find it. Keisha felt a wave of relief and validation. Finally, someone with authority was taking her suspicions seriously. Detective, she said, there's one more thing. Mrs. Hartford lied about her grandmother teaching her the tea recipe. She told Mrs. Whitmore that her grandmother died when she was 3 years old. Rodriguez wrote that down too. Interesting. Mrs. Hartford, would you like to clarify this discrepancy? The housekeeper looked from one person to another, like a cornered animal. Her options were rapidly running out, and for the first time in 4 years, she did not have complete control of the situation. You're turning minor inconsistencies into a conspiracy, she said, but her voice sounded less and less convincing. Mrs. Hartford, Catherine said softly, if you truly love Victoria as you've always said, help us understand what's going on. If there's an innocent explanation for all this. For a moment, something flashed across the governess's eyes. Remorse? Regret? But it was quickly replaced by something much colder. Explanation. She laughed bitterly. You want an explanation? Victoria has always been a difficult child. Crying, demanding, needy. Perhaps if you had been better parents, she wouldn't need disciplinary corrections. The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine brought her hand to her mouth in horror. James turned pale as a sheet. Even Rodriguez, accustomed to disturbing confessions, blinked in surprise. Keisha, however, was not surprised. She had seen this kind of twisted rationalization before, perpetrators blaming victims for their own cruelty. "Detective," she said calmly, "I think you just confessed that you were correcting a 6-year-old by systematically poisoning her." Mrs. Hartford realized what she had said. "No. I didn't say that. You're twisting my words." But it was too late. Rodriguez was already talking on the radio, calling for backup and a forensic team. Catherine was crying silently next to Victoria. James stood frozen, processing that he had entrusted his daughter's life to a woman who had just admitted to seeing her as a problem to be corrected. Keisha looked at Mrs. Hartford and saw no longer the elegant, controlled housekeeper, but a desperate woman whose mask had finally fallen. And that was just the beginning. What none of them knew yet was that Dorothy Hartford had not existed in official records for more than 15 years, and that the woman standing in that room had used at least 3 different identities in the last 2 years, always managing to get jobs caring for children in wealthy families. Families that, when investigated, had stories very similar to that of the Whitmores. But that would only be revealed when the whole truth came to light, in a way that would forever change how that family understood trust, privilege, and the difference between saving a life and simply doing their job. The forensic team arrived in less than 20 minutes. 3 technicians specializing in domestic crimes invaded the mansion's kitchen like surgeons performing an autopsy. Every utensil, every ingredient, every surface would be analyzed with scientific precision. Detective Rodriguez watched Mrs. Hartford with growing attention. His 15 years of experience had taught him to recognize the exact moment when a suspect realizes the walls are closing in. And Mrs. Hartford was rapidly reaching that point. "I found something," shouted one of the kitchen technicians. "Glass residue in the blender, small fragments in the tea strainer, and," he paused dramatically, "a plastic bag hidden behind the spices with finely ground glass." Catherine let out a muffled cry. James turned pale as a sheet. Mrs. Hartford, for the first time in 4 years, failed to maintain her elegant composure. This was planted," she stammered. "Someone is trying to frame me." "By whom?" Detective Rodriguez asked calmly. "Keisha has been working here for 3 days. How could she have planned such an elaborate scheme?" Keisha approached the detective. "Sir, may I make a suggestion? Check her identity. Something tells me Dorothy Hartford may not be her real name." Rodriguez nodded and picked up his radio. "Central, I need a full background check on Dorothy Hartford, approximately 58 years old." Mrs. Hartford took an involuntary step backward. "You can't do that. I have a right to privacy." "Actually," Rodriguez explained, "when there's suspicion of child poisoning, we can and will check everything." As they waited for the response, the second technician shouted from the pantry, "Detective! I found a diary." Everyone turned. Mrs. Hartford tried to run toward the pantry, but Rodriguez easily blocked her. "No!" she screamed, completely losing control. "You can't read that. It's private." The technician brought out a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten notes. Rodriguez opened it to the first page and began reading aloud. "Morrison family, Charlotte, age 8. Very spoiled, overly permissive parents. Beginning gradual disciplinary corrections. Small doses of detergent in milk did not work. Trying new approach." The silence in the room was absolute. Catherine held Victoria tighter, as if she could protect her retroactively. Rodriguez turned the page. "Chen family, little David, age 6. Extremely disobedient. Parents too absent. Excessive laxative caused hospitalization, too flashy. Need to be more subtle next time." "My God," James whispered. "How many families?" "Patterson family, Emma, age 7, Rodriguez continued reading. "Impossible child. Parents too wealthy to provide adequate education. Attempt with ground glass showed promising results. Symptoms easily confuse doctors. Method approved for future use." Mrs. Hartford collapsed into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "You don't understand. These children needed discipline. The parents were weak, too permissive. Someone had to teach them boundaries." "By poisoning them?" Catherine shouted, finally exploding. "You poisoned our daughter for 4 years because you thought she needed discipline?" "It wasn't 4 years." Mrs. Hartford shouted back, her mask of devoted governess completely shattered. It was only 6 months. Before that, I was just observing, studying, planning the best approach. Victoria was, especially challenging. Keisha felt nauseous. Particularly challenging? She's 6 years old. And too tearful. Too demanding. You spoiled her so much she became unbearable. Mrs. Hartford was completely beside herself now. I was just correcting your mistakes as parents. Rodriguez's radio crackled. Detective, we have information about Dorothy Hartford. Go ahead. There is number 58-year-old Dorothy Hartford in the records. But we found Margaret Coleman, 58, wanted in 3 states on suspicion of poisoning minors. Last known families: Morrison in Oregon, Chen in California, Patterson in Nevada. Catherine turned pale. All the families in the diary. Margaret Coleman was fired from every job under suspicion, but there was never enough evidence to prosecute, continued the voice on the radio. She always changed her identity and state before investigations were completed. Rodriguez looked at the woman collapsing in her chair. Margaret Coleman? She raised her head, and in her eyes there was no longer the devoted housekeeper. There was only coldness. Dorothy Hartford died 15 years ago. I just borrowed her name. What about the other families? Keisha asked. How many children did you hurt? Margaret laughed, a bitter, disturbing sound. Hurt? I educated them. Every child I worked with became better behaved, more respectful. The parents always thanked me for the transformation. Because they were afraid. James exploded. They were quiet because they were being poisoned. It worked, Margaret retorted with absolute coldness. And it would have worked with Victoria too, if that person hadn't interfered. She looked at Keisha with pure hatred. Detective Rodriguez picked up the handcuffs. Margaret Coleman, you are under arrest for attempted murder, poisoning a minor, identity fraud. Wait, Keisha interrupted. Detective, I have a question. Margaret, what happened to the other children? Emma Patterson, David Chun, Charlotte Morrison. Margaret hesitated before answering, and in that silence Keisha knew there was something worse. David Chun died, Margaret finally said, her voice low. Wrong dose. I miscalculated his weight. Catherine screamed. James had to hold onto the wall to keep from falling. Even Rodriguez was visibly shaken. Murder, he said, tightening the handcuffs with unnecessary force. You're under arrest for murder. It wasn't intentional. Margaret protested. I just wanted him to behave better. He was an impossible child. He was 5 years old, Rodriguez said coldly. While Rodriguez formalized the arrest, Keisha watched Catherine hug Victoria, who was finally waking up after hours under medical sedation. The girl opened her large, confused eyes, not understanding why so many strangers were in the house. Mommy. Victoria whispered weakly. I'm here, sweetheart, Catherine cried. You're safe now. Completely safe. James approached Keisha. How can I thank you? You saved our daughter. If it weren't for you. I just did what was right, Keisha replied simply. Victoria deserved someone who would pay attention to the signs. Margaret was led toward the door, but she paused and looked back one last time. You'll see, she said to Catherine and James. Without proper discipline, Victoria will become exactly the kind of spoiled, impossible child I was trying to correct. No, Keisha said calmly, she will become a happy, healthy child who grew up in a home where love is not confused with poisoning. When the door closed behind Margaret Coleman, silence finally returned to the Whitmore mansion. But it would not be the same silence of fear of the past few months. It was the silence of the storm that had finally passed. Detective Rodriguez finished writing down the last details. You will need to accompany Victoria to the hospital for complete tests to eliminate any toxic residue from her system. And you will be called to testify when the case goes to trial. Detective, Catherine asked, the other families, do they know what happened to their children? We will contact them immediately. Thanks to the evidence we found here and your testimony, we will finally be able to give them the answers they have been seeking for years. As the forensic team finished packing up the evidence, Keisha began gathering her cleaning supplies. Her work there was done. Where are you going? Catherine asked. "Look for another job," Keisha replied simply. "Bills don't pay themselves." But what neither Keisha nor the Whitmores knew yet was that Margaret Coleman's arrest would be just the beginning of a story that would change not only their lives, but the entire background check system for domestic caregivers. And that Keisha Washington, the cleaning lady who lost her medical license for doing the right thing, was about to discover that doing the right thing once again would open doors she never imagined possible. 6 months later, Keisha Washington walked the halls of General Hospital as a nursing supervisor. The Margaret Coleman case had sparked a national investigation that resulted in new screening laws for domestic caregivers. Margaret was sentenced to life in prison. David Chun was just one of 7 children she had poisoned over a period of 15 years. Catherine and James created the Victoria Foundation, offering scholarships to healthcare professionals like Keisha. Victoria, now fully recovered, made a point of visiting Keisha every week. "Aunt Keisha saved my life," she would always say, hugging the woman who had lost her career for doing the right thing, only to discover an even greater calling. The best revenge against an unjust system is not just to denounce the problem, it is to become the solution the world needs. If you believe that doing the right thing is worth any sacrifice, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that courage and knowledge can save lives when we least expect it.